There is a moment no one warns you about, when the most caring person in the room suddenly stops reacting. Not because they stopped feeling, but because feeling everything finally became too much to survive. And if you have ever felt drained by people who constantly pull you into their emotions, you need to understand what is really happening inside this shift. Because what looks like coldness is often something far deeper and far more psychological than most people realize. There is a terrifying threshold every empath eventually reaches. It is not something that happens suddenly without warning, even though it feels that way when it arrives. It builds slowly over years of absorbing emotions that were never meant to belong to you. It is not just tiredness or emotional burnout. It is the moment when something inside you quietly shifts and your inner light no longer responds in the same way. You still function, you still speak, you still show up in the world, but something essential feels different. The warmth that once came automatically begins to fade. Not because you want it to, but because your inner system has started protecting itself in a deeper way that you do not fully control or understand at first. It is not burnout in the simple sense people often describe. It is something more structural inside the mind and nervous system. It is the moment your light goes dark, not as an emotional collapse, but as a form of internal adjustment. You have spent years absorbing the emotional weight of others, sometimes without even noticing how much you were carrying. Pain, stress, anger, sadness, and confusion from other people have passed through you like they were your own responsibility. You kept holding it, processing it, and trying to remain calm for everyone else. Over time, this becomes less of a choice and more of a pattern your mind follows automatically until something inside begins to resist it. You were never taught the cost of this pattern. You were only taught the value of being understanding, kind, and emotionally available. So you continued to carry things that were not yours, believing this was simply who you are. But slowly, your inner balance begins to weaken. It is not visible from the outside, and most people would never notice it happening. Yet inside, something important is changing. The more you absorb, the less space you have for your own emotional stability. And when this imbalance continues long enough, the system that supports your empathy starts to reorganize itself in ways that feel unfamiliar and even uncomfortable to you. But Carl Jung warned that this is not just exhaustion or a temporary emotional state. It is a deeper psychological point where identity itself begins to shift. It is the moment where the former nice version of you, the one who always adapted, always understood, and always made space for others, starts to dissolve. This is not a dramatic event, but a quiet internal restructuring. The personality that was built around constant giving begins to weaken because it can no longer sustain itself. What replaces it is not yet fully formed, but it is more stable, more detached, and more focused on survival than on approval. So the question becomes more intense. Why does empathy suddenly shut off at this stage? Why does warmth disappear and leave behind something that feels colder and more distant? It is because the mind is no longer operating in the same way. What once felt automatic now feels blocked. You do not respond with the same emotional softness you used to. Instead, a kind of clarity appears that feels sharp and unfamiliar. This clarity is not emotional, it is observational. And for people who once depended on your emotional openness, this change feels unsettling because they no longer recognize the version of you they were used to. In this transformation, empathy does not simply vanish. It changes form. It stops being an open channel that absorbs everything and becomes something more selective and controlled. You still see emotions, you still understand them, but you are no longer pulled into them in the same way. This creates a gap between perception and participation. And in that gap, something new begins to form inside you. It is not a loss of humanity, but a shift in how your humanity expresses itself under pressure. What feels like emotional shutdown is actually a deeper form of internal protection beginning to activate. The warning. Too late. It started with the person you were shaped to become when you were young. A warning that should have reached you earlier in life, but instead arrives only now, when much of the transformation has already taken place. You were taught early how to give, how to forgive, and how to understand others even when it hurt you. These lessons were repeated so often that they became part of your identity. You learned that being emotionally available was a strength, and that holding space for others was a form of goodness. But what was never explained was the hidden cost of living this way continuously. From a young age, you were conditioned to believe that your worth was connected to how much emotional support you could offer. If someone was struggling, you were expected to listen. If someone was angry or upset, you were expected to stay calm. If someone was confused or hurt, you were expected to understand them. Over time, this becomes your default way of existing in relationships. You begin to measure yourself by how well you can maintain peace for others, even if it disrupts your own internal balance. This creates a silent pattern of emotional overextension that no one notices at first. What no one told you is that this constant emotional availability comes with a cost that builds slowly over time. There is a hidden exchange happening every time you absorb someone else's emotional state. You give away a part of your own internal stability without realizing it. At first, it feels manageable because your mind compensates. But when this continues for years, the system begins to weaken. You are no longer just being empathetic in moments of need. You are constantly operating in a state of emotional openness that never fully closes. Carl Jung's perspective helps explain this in a deeper way. He describes something called psychic energy, which is not physical energy, but the total capacity of your mind to engage with life. When you are constantly absorbing others, you are not just being kind, you are using your internal energy to stabilize their emotional world. Over time, this creates imbalance. Your attention, your focus, and your emotional strength begin to flow outward more than they return inward. And when this continues without recovery, your mind begins to adjust in order to prevent collapse. Your psyche does not simply break when overwhelmed. Instead, it reorganizes itself. Jung described it as a self-regulating system that tries to restore balance. When too much energy flows outward for too long, the system does not stay the same. It changes structure. It begins to reduce output in order to prevent further loss. This is not something you consciously decide. It happens automatically as a form of protection. You are not choosing to shut down emotionally. Your mind is adjusting the flow of energy so you do not completely drain yourself in the same way again. This is why your reactions begin to change in situations that once triggered empathy immediately. You may find yourself in conversations where someone is expressing frustration or insecurity, and instead of automatically absorbing it, something different happens. There is a pause, a distance, a sense of observation instead of participation. Where you once would have felt pulled into their emotional state, you now remain slightly outside of it. This shift can feel unsettling because it breaks a pattern that once defined your identity. For a moment, this can create fear. You may wonder if something is wrong with you. You may question whether you are becoming less caring or losing your emotional depth. But from a Jungian perspective, this is not a defect. It is a response to long-term imbalance. The system is not failing, it is correcting itself. It is reducing emotional leakage in order to preserve what remains of your internal stability. What feels like emotional coldness is actually controlled separation between you and what you once absorbed automatically. This change often feels like the loss of a familiar version of yourself. The part of you that always understood, always accommodated, and always explained other people's behavior begins to weaken. In its place, a more detached awareness emerges. You start to see situations more clearly, without immediately filtering them through emotional interpretation. This can feel uncomfortable because it removes the softness you were used to relying on. But it also reveals patterns you were previously too emotionally involved to see clearly. The mind begins to prioritize survival over social harmony. It stops automatically giving emotional energy to situations that drain you without return. This is not a moral change, but a functional one. Your internal system is trying to reduce overload by limiting unnecessary emotional expenditure. And as this process continues, you begin to experience yourself differently. You are still capable of empathy, but it is no longer uncontrolled or automatic. It becomes selective, measured, and protected. What follows is often a period of confusion. You may feel disconnected from how you used to be. You may question whether you are still the same person. But this uncertainty is part of the transition. The old emotional patterns are no longer fully active, yet the new ones are not fully integrated. You are in between states of identity, where the old version of emotional giving is fading and a more stable, self-protective version is emerging. In the next stage of this transformation, the nervous system begins to play a more direct role. It is no longer just psychological, it becomes physiological. Your body starts deciding what emotional input it can tolerate and what it cannot. And at that point, empathy stops being something you consciously manage and becomes something your entire system regulates automatically. For an empath, the shadow is not only made of your own hidden impulses, it also holds the emotional material of other people that you absorb through constant contact with them. Every time you were lied to and chose silence just to keep peace, you were taking in the psychological structure of that lie. Every time a narcissistic person used your guilt to guide your behavior, you were learning the exact pattern of that control. You were not studying human darkness in theory, you were being shaped by it in real time, through repeated exposure, where every interaction added another layer of understanding without your conscious permission. Over time, this creates something inside you that is not obvious at first. It is an internal map of human behavior built from lived experience instead of observation from a distance. You begin to notice small details others miss. The timing of a pause in speech, the shift in tone when someone is hiding intention, the subtle changes in facial expression when truth is being bent. You've seen these patterns so many times that they become stored knowledge in your nervous system. It is not something you intentionally learned, but something your mind recorded while trying to survive emotionally demanding situations repeatedly. This is why your perception of people becomes sharper over time. You are no longer only reacting to what is said, but also to what is implied underneath it. You recognize when kindness is being used as a tool instead of a feeling. You notice when someone's generosity carries hidden expectations. You see when approval is being offered as a form of control rather than genuine care. This awareness does not come from judgment, but from accumulated experience that your mind has organized into a silent reference system that operates automatically in the background of your awareness. Jung suggested that what is denied does not disappear. It remains in the unconscious and continues to influence behavior until it is acknowledged. For a long time, you may have pushed away what you noticed because it did not match the identity you held of yourself as a kind and understanding person. You wanted to believe that people were mostly good, and that your role was to understand them, not to analyze them. So whenever you noticed something darker in others, you often dismissed it or explained it away to preserve emotional harmony. But that denial does not erase perception. It only stores it deeper. The unconscious continues recording everything, especially moments of emotional conflict, manipulation, or imbalance. Over time, this stored material forms a large internal archive of human behavior under pressure. You may not think about it directly, but it influences how you feel around certain people or situations. A sense of heaviness or discomfort can appear before you consciously understand why, because your system has already recognized familiar patterns from past experiences. At a social gathering, this awareness becomes even more noticeable. You may be speaking with someone who is widely seen as kind or generous. On the surface, nothing appears unusual. They may be smiling, speaking politely, and sharing stories of helping others. But something in their pattern of speech feels familiar in a different way. You begin to notice how their kindness is being described in a structured, almost performative manner. It feels less like natural expression and more like something being presented for effect. In the past, you might have ignored this feeling and redirected your attention elsewhere to avoid judgment. You would have questioned your own interpretation rather than the behavior in front of you. But now, because of everything you have previously experienced, that interpretation becomes harder to dismiss. Your internal map recognizes similar behavioral structures from earlier situations. You see patterns that match previous experiences of manipulation or emotional imbalance. This recognition is not emotional at first. It is observational and quiet, like a system comparing current input with stored data. As this awareness strengthens, you begin to see intention behind behavior more clearly. You notice when someone is subtly positioning themselves as superior through kindness. You observe when generosity is used to create social advantage. You recognize when praise is given in a way that creates obligation instead of connection. These insights are not conclusions you force. They arise automatically from accumulated recognition of repeated patterns across time. This shift changes how you experience social environments. You are no longer fully immersed in emotional reactions. Instead, part of your awareness remains detached, observing structure rather than being pulled into it. You can still feel empathy, but it is no longer blind or automatic. It is filtered through recognition of context. You are able to see both the emotional surface and the behavioral structure underneath it at the same time. This does not make you cynical. It makes your perception more layered. You are no longer only responding to what people say, but also to the function behind their words. You begin to understand that communication often has multiple levels operating simultaneously. There is what is expressed and there is what is being attempted. This dual awareness becomes part of how you process interaction. Over time, this creates a psychological shift in identity. You are no longer only the person who feels deeply. You are also the person who recognizes patterns of emotional behavior with increasing clarity. This does not remove empathy, but it changes its form. It becomes less reactive and more analytical, less absorbent and more observational. You begin to experience emotional situations with both feeling and structure at the same time, rather than being fully absorbed into them. This accumulation of awareness can feel heavy because it changes how innocence functions within perception. You are no longer able to unsee certain patterns once they have been recognized. The mind does not erase them, it stores them and uses them as reference points for future understanding. This creates a sense of internal weight, as if your awareness is carrying more information than before. It is not emotional overload in the traditional sense, but informational depth that changes how reality is interpreted. As this continues, you begin to realize that your sensitivity was never only about feeling emotions. It was also about absorbing behavioral truth without filtering it out. You were not just feeling people, you were recording them internally. And over time, this recording becomes a structured understanding of human behavior under emotional pressure. This is why certain environments now feel different to you, even when nothing obvious has changed on the surface. There is also a point where this stored understanding begins to influence your presence in social situations. You may notice that you speak less impulsively and observe more before responding. You begin to wait before reacting emotionally because part of your awareness is now processing behavior rather than immediately engaging with it. This delay creates space between perception and reaction, and in that space, clarity forms. At this stage, your internal world begins to feel more structured and less emotionally chaotic than before. You are still sensitive, but your sensitivity is no longer uncontrolled. It has become organized through experience. You can now distinguish between emotional expression that is genuine and emotional expression that is strategic. This distinction becomes almost automatic, forming a quiet layer of understanding beneath everyday interaction. The important realization here is that nothing you absorbed was ever lost. Every interaction, every emotional exchange, every moment of confusion or discomfort has contributed to this internal structure. You are not the same person who first began absorbing these experiences. You have become someone who carries both emotional awareness and behavioral understanding at the same time. And this combination begins to change how you exist in relationships, often without you actively trying to change anything. Eventually, this accumulation reaches a point where it can no longer remain only in the background. It begins to influence your conscious identity more directly. What was once passive observation becomes active awareness. And this is where the deeper transformation starts to take shape, where perception itself begins to reorganize around what has been learned rather than what was once assumed. It is factual in the sense that it gives you a different way of reading human behavior, one that reduces the constant confusion that comes from naive empathy. You stop endlessly questioning why people behave in certain ways, because in most cases, the answer becomes visible through patterns you have already seen before. You begin to recognize when guilt is being used as a tool, when obligation is being manufactured in real time, and when emotional pressure is being applied with a clear intention behind it. Once you identify these patterns as tactics rather than truth, they lose their emotional grip on you. What once pulled you into confusion now feels predictable, almost transparent, and your mind no longer reacts in the same automatic way it used to. You're in a public setting, and someone tries to push you into agreeing to something you do not want. They choose the timing carefully, using the presence of others to increase pressure and reduce your ability to refuse without discomfort. In your earlier state, this would have triggered embarrassment, hesitation, and compliance, simply to avoid tension or attention. But now something different happens. You see the structure of the situation clearly. You recognize the calculation behind their timing, and the social pressure being applied. Instead of being pulled into their emotional frame, you remain anchored in your own internal clarity. You refuse, calmly, without over-explaining or softening your position, and you stay steady even as they react emotionally to your boundary. With this shift, you begin to see that what once controlled you was not force, but expectation, the subtle demand that you adjust yourself to maintain harmony. That expectation loses its authority over you, even though you are still aware of it. Your presence becomes more stable and less reactive, shaped by internal clarity rather than external pressure. People may interpret this change as coldness or distance, but what has actually changed is your availability for emotional manipulation. You are no longer automatically absorbing pressure, and your care is no longer given in ways that cost your own stability. Instead, you operate from a place of conscious choice, where silence, boundaries, and awareness replace automatic compliance and emotional overextension. In the end, this entire journey is not about becoming cold, detached, or disconnected from people. It is about becoming aware of yourself in a deeper way and learning where your responsibility ends and where other people's emotions begin. You move from unconscious reactions to conscious choices, where your empathy is no longer something that drains you, but something you understand and direct with clarity. Instead of being pulled into every emotional current around you, you learn to stay grounded in your own inner stability while still recognizing the feelings of others without losing yourself in them. What remains after all the confusion, overgiving, and emotional exhaustion is a more balanced sense of identity. You are no longer living only to maintain harmony at your own expense, but to build a life that is stable, clear, and internally aligned. This does not remove your ability to care. It strengthens it by making it intentional rather than automatic. True emotional maturity is not the absence of empathy, but the presence of boundaries, awareness, and self-respect working together.